I held the crisp acceptance letter from Spelman College, feeling the full-ride scholarship, promising to change my entire life. My mother Valerie did not even blink before snatching the thick parchment from my grip and ripping it. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed through our dining room. She quickly dropped the shredded pieces onto my plate of sweet potato pie. "No daughter of mine is going to waste money on an education," she announced, her voice dripping with pure venom as she adjusted her designer pearls. "You are working reception at the church starting Monday. Your salary goes directly into the family fund, so your older sister Dominique can finally open her luxury boutique down in Buckhead." I sat completely frozen, unable to process the cruelty. My older sister Dominique just smirked across the table, swirling her expensive wineglass. Then my grandfather Jeremiah slowly set his silver fork down on the heavy mahogany table. The sharp metallic clink made my mother flinch. He did not yell. He did not even raise his deep voice. He calmly stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked dead into my mother's eyes. "Go upstairs and pack your things," he told me, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You will definitely start school in the fall." My mother let out a loud, mocking laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "And who is going to pay for her life, Jeremiah? You. With what money from your little barber shop down in the West End? You barely make enough to keep the lights on." My grandfather did not smile at all. He simply reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a folded legal document, and slid it smoothly across the table until it touched her plate. "That is a 30-day eviction notice, Valerie," he said softly. "I own this entire house, and you have exactly 1 month to find a new place to host your fake society dinners." Her laughter stopped instantly. The color drained from her face as she stared silently at the red stamp. 10 years passed since that Thanksgiving. 10 years of building my life entirely outside of Valerie's toxic shadow, after she essentially disowned me for choosing Spelman over funding Dominique's endless vanity projects. Now, at exactly 28 years old, I stood outside the massive iron doors of Valerie's new Buckhead mansion. My grandfather Jeremiah had passed away 3 days ago, and today was his post-funeral reception. I adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored black suit. It was understated but razor-sharp. I took a deep breath, pushing down the heavy grief in my chest, and pushed the double doors open, stepping into a foyer overflowing with Atlanta's social elite. The house smelled of expensive catering and fake sympathy. Before I could even locate the memorial guest book to sign my name, a silver tray full of caviar appetizers was shoved directly into my chest. Dominique stood blocking my path. She wore an overly dramatic black lace gown that looked far more appropriate for a red carpet gala than a memorial service for our grandfather. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, her lips curling into a familiar sneer of absolute disgust. "Use the back door immediately, Maya," she hissed, keeping her voice low so the nearby wealthy church wives would not overhear her vitriol. "My high society friends are here, and your cheap temp worker vibe is completely ruining the aesthetic I spent weeks curating for this event." I looked at the tray, then back at her face, holding my ground firmly. "I am here to honor the only person in this family who actually cared about me, Dominique." Her dark eyes flared with immediate rage. She stepped closer, her heavy, expensive perfume suffocating the small space between us. "You have a truly massive amount of nerve showing your face here after disappearing for a decade," she snapped, jabbing a manicured finger toward my shoulder. "Grandpa is gone, Maya. Nobody here is going to protect you anymore. You do not belong in this house or in our circle. You are just a massive embarrassment who could not even afford a proper dress for a funeral." Before I could respond to her tired insults, a heavy hand clapped onto my shoulder from behind. Connor, my sister's white husband, shoved his way into our conversation. He was a ruthless real estate developer who made his living buying up historic black neighborhoods and replacing them with overpriced coffee shops and generic luxury apartment complexes. He wore a flashy designer suit and always tried way too hard to sound like he belonged in our culture, using slang that felt forced and deeply condescending. "What is going on here, fam?" Connor asked loudly, wrapping his arm tightly around Dominique's waist and pulling her close. He looked me up and down, with an arrogant smirk, completely unbothered by the solemn fact that we were standing at my grandfather's funeral reception. Ah, if it isn't the prodigal sister returning from the wilderness to get a free meal. Listen, Maya, let us cut to the chase and keep it 100. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed a personal check right at my chest. It fluttered through the air and landed on the marble floor right by the toes of my leather shoes. I glanced down at the paper. It was a check made out to me for exactly $5,000. Here is some pocket change, kiddo, Connor said loudly, flashing a brilliant artificial smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Just sign over Grandpa's useless barbershop lot in the West End to my development firm and we will call it even. Save yourself the property taxes on that rundown shack and go buy yourself something nice. Maybe a suit that actually fits your body. You know my firm is doing big things for the culture, Maya. That dirt patch is just holding the neighborhood back. I stared silently at the check resting on the cold marble floor, feeling the familiar intense heat of anger rising quickly in my chest, but I kept my breathing steady and my face completely blank. I did not bend down to pick up the paper. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing the heel of my black leather pump directly dead center on the $5,000 check. I ground it slightly into the polished marble floor. Connor let out a sharp breath of disbelief, his artificial smile faltering as he looked from my shoe up to my eyes. I tilted my head, keeping my voice completely level. You really need to stop trying to sound like you grew up in the West End, Connor. You are a real estate developer from Connecticut. The forced slang is not making you look culturally aware, it just makes you look ridiculous. A few of the older church ladies standing near the doorway gasped softly, clutching their beaded handbags. Dominique stepped forward, her face flushing with immediate rage, ready to defend her husband, but Connor held up a hand to stop her. He was trying hard to maintain his cool, sophisticated businessman persona in front of the wealthy guests. I'm just trying to speak a language you understand, Maya, he said, his tone turning icy and deeply condescending. I am offering you a way out of a bad financial situation. That old barbershop is a complete eyesore. The roof is caving in, the plumbing is shot, and the property taxes are going to eat you alive on a receptionist's salary. I am doing you a massive favor here. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Doing me a favor? I repeated, stepping closer to him. My grandfather owned that barbershop for 40 years. It was a cornerstone for Black men in this city, a place where community leaders gathered and real conversations happened. It is a piece of living history. You do not care about history unless you can pave over it. But let us put sentimentality aside for a moment and talk pure business. You build luxury high-rises and overpriced commercial complexes. You deal exclusively in multi-million-dollar developments. So tell me, Connor, why is a developer of your magnitude literally begging me for a useless 500-square-foot dirt patch in a neighborhood you claim has absolutely no value? Connor's jaw clenched tight. The veins in his neck visibly pulsed against his stiff white collar. He opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated clearly, not expecting me to question his motives so directly. He quickly recovered, pasting that fake charming smile back on his face. It is called urban revitalization, he said smoothly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. My firm is trying to uplift the urban community. We want to bring fresh capital into the area, create temporary construction jobs, and build modern infrastructure for the future. I am trying to fix the neighborhoods that people like your grandfather let fall into ruin. He said the word ruin with such heavy disdain, as if working-class survival was a disease he needed to cure. My blood boiled at the blatant insult to my grandfather's legacy. To stand in a house paid for by my grandfather's quiet sacrifices and hear this vulture dismiss a lifetime of honest labor was almost too much to bear. But before I could tear into his hypocritical savior complex, my mother pushed her way to the front of the group. Valerie was practically vibrating with fury, her perfectly contoured face contorted with the kind of rage she usually reserved for closed doors. "How dare you speak to him that way?" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. The society women behind her whispered among themselves, exchanging hungry looks of gossip, but she did not care. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger right at my face. Connor is an absolute saint for even trying to help you. He funds this entire family's lifestyle. He is the reason Dominique has a successful business. He is the reason we are standing in this beautiful home, honoring your grandfather properly today. I looked around the lavish foyer, taking in the massive crystal chandelier, the imported floral arrangements, and the hired waiters carrying silver trays of expensive appetizers. The sheer opulence of a funeral reception designed entirely to show off Valerie's supposed wealth, rather than mourn a great man. "You call this honoring him?" I asked quietly. Granddad hated this kind of superficial display. He was a humble, hardworking man who cared about his community, not about impressing a bunch of country club snobs with shrimp toast and expensive champagne. Valerie stepped so close to me, I could smell the sharp tang of her signature perfume mixed heavily with the alcohol on her breath. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed, grabbing my forearm with a bruising, punishing grip. "You have been nothing but a constant disappointment since the day you were born. You refused to listen to me about college. You refused to make anything of yourself. And now you come into my home and openly insult the man who actually takes care of us." She shook my arm roughly. "You are going to pick up that check right now, Maya. You are going to sign that piece of paper and transfer the deed to Connor today. You owe this family for dealing with your failures all these years. Sign it now, and show a little bit of gratitude for once in your miserable life." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I just stared at her fingers until she nervously let go, taking a half step back. The silence in the foyer was deafening. Every single guest was watching, waiting to see the family scapegoat finally crack under the heavy emotional pressure. Dominique crossed her arms, looking incredibly smug, fully convinced that their united front had successfully broken me down. I reached into the pocket of my suit jacket, but I did not pull out a pen to sign Connor's predatory contract. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and tapped open my private banking application. I navigated to the transaction history, holding the screen up so my mother and Connor could clearly see the glowing green numbers. "I really do not need his $5,000, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "And as for Connor funding this family's lavish lifestyle, I think you need to take a much closer look at your golden son's actual finances before you start praising his generosity." Valerie squinted at the screen, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Connor leaned in, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he read the transaction details on my display. I swiped my finger across the screen, highlighting the most recent payment. "I just paid off the $25,000 catering bill for this entire funeral reception," I announced, watching the smug satisfaction completely drain from Dominique's face. The catering manager threatened to pack up all the food and walk out an hour before the guests arrived. "Do you want to know why, Mother?" I turned my phone to face the crowd of society gossips, ensuring everyone in the room could hear my next words perfectly. "Because Connor's exclusive platinum credit card was declined this morning for insufficient funds." The absolute silence that swallowed the grand foyer was deafening. You could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning and the soft clinking of champagne flutes from the adjacent dining room. Connor stared at the digital receipt glowing on my phone screen. His face, previously a mask of arrogant confidence, turned a violently blotchy shade of crimson. The thick veins in his neck seemed ready to burst. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Dominique snatched her phone from her designer clutch, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she furiously typed out a message, likely checking their joint accounts. The older church ladies, who had been whispering behind their hands just moments before, were now staring at Connor with wide eyes. In Buckhead society, there was no greater sin than projecting wealth you did not actually possess. My mother Valerie recognized the immediate danger to her social standing. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, watching her carefully cultivated image begin to crack under the weight of my revelation. She needed a distraction, and she needed it instantly. She clapped her hands together, a sharp cracking sound that broke the heavy tension. "Ladies and gentlemen," Valerie announced, her voice pitched an octave higher than normal in a desperate bid for control. We are going to move into the formal living room now. My father's attorney has arrived to read the final will and testament. It is highly unorthodox to do this today, I know, but Jeremiah always hated dragging things out in stuffy law offices. She shot a venomous glare in my direction. Plus, it seems we have some family business that needs to be permanently settled right this minute. She grabbed Connor's arm, digging her manicured nails into his expensive suit jacket, and dragged him toward the massive double doors of the living room. Dominique followed closely behind, looking like a terrified child. I lowered my phone, slipping it back into my pocket, and followed the crowd. The man waiting for us in the living room was not Mr. Sterling, my grandfather's trusted lawyer of 30 years. Instead, a sweaty, nervous-looking man in a cheap polyester suit stood by the fireplace clutching a thin manila folder. He wiped his brow with a crumpled handkerchief as Valerie took her place beside him, posing as the grieving but resilient matriarch. "This is Mr. Davis," Connor announced, recovering a fraction of his fake bravado. He is a highly respected property and estate attorney who graciously agreed to handle Jeremiah's final affairs after the previous counsel was dismissed for incompetence. I crossed my arms, keeping my face completely passive. My grandfather would never have hired a man whose shoes were scuffed and whose hands shook while opening a simple folder. Connor had clearly found someone desperate enough to play along with whatever scheme he had cooked up. Mr. Davis cleared his throat loudly, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room, especially me. The document he pulled out consisted of only 2 pages, which was absurdly short for an estate as complex as my grandfather's. "I will keep this brief as per the family's request," Mr. Davis mumbled, his voice cracking slightly. "I, Jeremiah Wilson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils. I leave my entire estate, including all personal property, liquid assets, and real estate holdings, fully and exclusively to my only daughter, Valerie." A collective murmur rippled through the room. I did not blink. I just stared at the sweaty lawyer, watching a drop of perspiration roll down his temple. And as for my granddaughter Maya, the lawyer continued reading faster now, as if he wanted to get the words out before the floor opened up and swallowed him. "I leave her nothing. She has strayed too far from the values of this family and must learn to make her own way in the world without my financial assistance." Dominique let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. Valerie stood taller, lifting her chin with triumphant satisfaction. She turned to me, a cold, victorious smile spreading across her face. "You heard the man, Maya," Valerie said, her voice ringing with sheer delight. "My father finally saw you for exactly what you are, a bitter, ungrateful burden. Now that this house, the bank accounts, and the properties are legally mine, I am going to do what he should have done years ago." Connor eagerly stepped forward, pulling a folded document from his inner pocket and slamming it down on the glass coffee table. He handed Valerie a gold-plated pen. "Sign right here on the dotted line." Valerie, Connor instructed, his fake accent completely gone, replaced by the hungry tone of a corporate predator. "This transfers the West End barbershop lot directly to Vanguard Real Estate. We will get that eyesore torn down and start uplifting the community by tomorrow morning." Valerie did not even read the document. She did not ask a single question about the terms, the sale price, or the legacy of the building, where my grandfather had spent 40 years cutting hair and mentoring young black men. She simply clicked the pen and scrawled her extravagant signature across the bottom line, tossing the paper back to Connor. "Done," she declared, looking at me with pure malice. "Now get out of my house, Maya. You have no money, no inheritance, and absolutely no reason to be here." I looked at the forged will in the lawyer's trembling hands, and then at the property deed Connor was currently folding into his pocket. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost impressive in its sloppiness. They really thought I was just a struggling receptionist who would walk away crying. "That signature on the will is a complete fake," I said, my voice slicing through the thick air of the living room. Grandpa had severe arthritis in his right hand for the last 2 years of his life. He could not write his signature with that kind of perfect fluid pressure. "You two are pathetic." Valerie's face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She snapped her fingers, signaling the 2 massive private security guards standing by the doorway. Remove this trespassing trash from my property, Valerie screamed, pointing directly at my chest. If she resists, throw her down the front steps. The guards moved instantly. Two heavy hands grabbed my shoulders, gripping the fabric of my custom suit. I did not struggle. I did not give Dominique the satisfaction of seeing me dragged out like a common criminal. I simply adjusted my stance and allowed them to march me backward toward the grand entryway. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, whispering and shaking their heads as I was paraded out the door. As the guards shoved me onto the front porch, the heavy mahogany doors began to close. Connor slipped through the gap just before it shut, stepping out into the humid Atlanta night air. He walked down the stone steps alongside me, a disgusting, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. "Game over, little girl," Connor whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You thought you were so smart bringing up that catering bill, but it does not matter now. I have the deed." The bulldozers hit the West End lot at exactly 8 in the morning. Bye-bye, Grandpa's useless legacy. There is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me. He turned around, laughing softly to himself, and walked back inside the mansion, leaving me alone in the dark driveway. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the night air. I reached up and smoothly straightened the lapels of my jacket, brushing off where the security guards had grabbed me. I walked over to my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I closed the door, shutting out the noise of Valerie's ridiculous mansion. I did not cry. I did not panic. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a highly secure priority number. The line rang exactly twice before my chief financial officer answered. "Execute Phase 1. I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet cabin of my car. "I want Vanguard Real Estate's primary escrow accounts completely frozen. I want their credit lines blocked, and I want a full hold on every single asset they have in play. Shut them down." The next evening, the crystal chandeliers of the Four Seasons Hotel ballroom illuminated the absolute peak of Atlanta's black elite. My mother, Valerie, had wasted no time at all. Less than 24 hours after staging a fake will reading and literally stealing my grandfather's property, she was throwing a massive charity gala. It was her ultimate victory lap. She had invited every prominent socialite, local politician, and wealthy business mogul she could find, determined to cement her newly fabricated status as a real estate tycoon. She was parading around, using the money she thought Connor was bringing in to buy her way into the inner circle she had worshipped from afar her entire life. It was a pathetic display of a woman desperate for validation from people who would never truly respect her. I stood just outside the grand double doors of the ballroom, listening to the soft jazz music and the pretentious clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I was no longer wearing the simple black suit from the funeral. That version of me, the quiet, struggling scapegoat who took their abuse in silence, was dead and buried. Tonight I wore a custom $15,000 emerald green haute couture gown. It was a masterpiece of heavy silk and hand-stitched beadwork that draped flawlessly across my figure, highlighting the confidence I had kept buried for a decade. My hair was perfectly styled, and genuine diamond teardrop earrings framed my face, catching the warm ambient light with every slight movement. For 10 long years, I had hidden my wealth, allowing my deeply arrogant family to believe I was nothing more than a struggling receptionist living paycheck to paycheck. I did it to protect my peace of mind and to protect my assets from their insatiable, bottomless greed. I knew that if Valerie or Dominique ever caught wind of my financial success, they would have demanded every single penny, playing the family card to bleed me completely dry. But the time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. I signaled the two uniformed event ushers standing by the entrance. They pulled open the heavy oak doors, and I stepped directly into the blinding light of the ballroom. The effect was instantaneous and incredibly satisfying. A group of wealthy wives standing near the entrance literally gasped, taking in the breathtaking sight of my gown. The low hum of polite conversation began to die out, sweeping across the massive room like a tidal wave as heads turned in my direction. I kept my posture straight and my gaze fixed, walking with the kind of unbothered, dangerous confidence that only comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly how much power you hold over the people who tried to destroy you. Across the room, I spotted my mother. Valerie was draped in an overly flashy gold sequined dress, laughing loudly at some joke Connor had just made. She was clutching a glass of expensive champagne, acting like the Queen of Atlanta. Then she saw me. Her loud laughter died instantly in her throat. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she took in the expensive fabric sweeping across the floor and the diamonds glittering at my ears. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. But it was my older sister Dominique who reacted first. She was standing near a massive swan ice sculpture wearing a white silk slip dress that she had undoubtedly charged to one of her maxed-out credit cards. When she saw me glowing in a dress that cost more than her entire seasonal inventory, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered jealousy. I watched her dark eyes dart frantically, taking in the quality of my gown, the perfect cut of the fabric, and the unmistakable aura of genuine wealth that I was effortlessly projecting. Dominique could not handle being upstaged. She had spent her entire adult life playing the beautiful, successful golden child while treating me like absolute garbage. She was the one who was supposed to be the wealthy fashion icon, while I was supposed to be the miserable failure. Seeing me look better, wealthier, and more powerful than her in front of her high society friends triggered a deeply pathetic panic inside her. She slammed her empty champagne flute onto a passing waiter's tray and aggressively snatched a full glass of dark red wine. She stormed across the ballroom floor, marching directly toward me, with her chin held high and her shoulders pulled back. A few guests stepped aside, sensing the immediate hostile tension radiating from her rigid body. Dominique stopped right in front of me, her chest heaving as she glared down at my emerald dress, trying desperately to regain the upper hand. "Did you steal a credit card to rent? That Maya?" she sneered, her voice raised loud enough for the nearest tables of wealthy investors to hear. "Or did you finally find a desperate sugar daddy willing to dress up a charity case for the night? You have absolutely no business being here. This is an exclusive event for actual professionals, not bitter college dropouts looking for a free meal from our mother." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just looked at her with a calm, steady gaze that seemed to infuriate her even more. She shifted her weight, preparing to bump into my shoulder. I saw the muscles in her arm tense. I knew exactly what she was about to do. It was the exact same petty high school trick she used whenever another woman threatened her fragile spotlight. She stumbled forward deliberately, tipping the heavy glass of dark red wine directly toward the bodice of my expensive silk gown. My reflexes were much faster than her clumsy attempt at sabotage. Before a single drop of wine could leave the rim of the crystal glass, my hand shot out. I caught her wrist mid-air, gripping her delicate bones with a punishing, unyielding force. Dominique gasped in sharp pain and genuine shock, freezing completely as the red liquid sloshed dangerously close to the edge of the glass, but never spilled a single drop onto my dress. The music seemed to fade away as the surrounding guests stared at us in stunned silence. I stepped closer to my sister, refusing to let go of her trapped wrist. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper that was sharp enough to cut glass. "I really would not do that, Dominique," I said, watching the color drain out of her perfectly contoured face. "If you ruin this custom dress, you definitely will not be able to afford the dry cleaning bill, especially considering your highly successful luxury boutique officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon." The color completely vanished from Dominique's perfectly contoured face. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for any sign that I was bluffing or making a sick joke. When she found only the cold, hard truth staring back at her from my unwavering gaze, panic completely overtook her. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy, successful fashion icon crumbled in a matter of seconds. With a sharp, incoherent scream of rage, she wrenched her trapped wrist from my grip. Her chest heaved violently as she swung her free hand, aiming a vicious, open-palmed slap right at my cheek. I did not even flinch. I simply took a calm, measured half-step backward. The sheer force and momentum of her own swinging arm threw Dominique entirely off balance. Her expensive high heels twisted painfully on the polished marble floor. She let out a loud gasp as she stumbled forward, losing her grip on the crystal glass she had been holding. The heavy goblet slipped from her trembling fingers and slammed onto the ground. It shattered with a sharp, violent crash that echoed like a gunshot through the sudden silence of the ballroom. A dark pool of expensive red wine splattered across the pristine white tiles, stopping just inches from the hem of my emerald gown. Every single head in the grand ballroom snapped in our direction. The gentle jazz music playing softly in the background abruptly stopped as the musicians faltered. The security guard standing by the massive mahogany doors tensed visibly, but before anyone else could intervene, my mother was already pushing her way through the crowd of stunned socialites. Valerie was practically running her heavy gold sequined dress, catching the ambient light as she hurried over. In her manicured hand, she gripped the cordless microphone she had been using to thank her wealthy donors just moments before. She arrived breathless, looking frantically from the shattered glass, and spilled wine on the floor to Dominique's humiliated, trembling form and finally to me. Instead of asking what happened or showing any genuine concern for the scene unfolding in front of her, Valerie immediately reverted to her favorite defense mechanism. She needed to protect her newly fabricated status as a real estate tycoon and high society matriarch at all costs. And the fastest way to do that was to paint me as the absolute villain. She raised the microphone to her lips, ensuring her voice would project loud and clear through the massive ballroom speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse this highly unfortunate disruption," Valerie announced, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured maternal sorrow. "This young woman standing before you is my youngest daughter, Maya." A collective murmur of pity and shocked whispers swept through the crowd of politicians, business executives, and wealthy wives. Valerie placed a dramatic hand over her heart, continuing her performance for the captivated audience. She has struggled with severe mental instability and bitter jealousy for years. Valerie lied, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. She dropped out of college and has done absolutely nothing but resent her older sister's incredible success ever since. Tonight, she has clearly come here to ruin an evening dedicated to charity out of pure spite and desperation. I ask for your patience and understanding while security escorts her out so she can get the professional help she so desperately needs. The society women whispered among themselves, looking at me like I was a tragic spectacle, a broken woman having a public breakdown. Valerie reached out with her free hand to signal the guards, her face masked in fake grief, but her eyes flashing with cruel victory. She fully expected me to hang my head in shame and walk away, just like I always did when I was a teenager. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. I did not give the security team a single chance to move toward me. I took 2 fluid, confident steps forward, instantly closing the distance between my mother and myself. Before Valerie could even register what was happening, I smoothly and calmly reached out and slipped the microphone right out of her trembling hand. Valerie gasped in pure shock, stepping back as if she had been physically struck. I brought the microphone to my mouth and turned slowly to look out at the vast sea of wealthy donors. My voice rang out clear, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion, cutting through the whispers like a steel blade. "I am not unstable, and I am certainly not jealous," I stated, projecting my words across the deadly silent ballroom. "My sister Dominique likes to project the image of a highly successful fashion mogul to all of you. She attends your luncheons and your country club dinners, pretending to be a brilliant entrepreneur. But the absolute truth is that her so-called luxury boutique has not sold a single dress in 6 long months." A loud wave of gasps erupted from the crowd. The wealthy socialites who had just been pitying me were now staring at Dominique with wide, horrified eyes. In this circle, failure was bad, but faking success was an unforgivable crime. Valerie stared at me, her jaw actually dropping open. Her eyes grew wide with rising terror as she finally realized she had absolutely no control over what I was about to say next. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I simply spoke over her, my voice dominating the room. "Dominique has been keeping the lights on at her failing business by taking out massive predatory loans." I continued, turning slowly to look directly at my mother. Valerie's face was now completely devoid of color, looking as pale as a sheet. And she did not use her own ruined credit to do it. I announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard the next sentence perfectly. She forged the financial paperwork and took out every single one of those high-interest loans entirely under your name, Mother. The crushing debt she has secretly saddled you with currently stands at exactly $3 million. The ballroom erupted into a frantic, hungry buzzing. It was not the polite murmur of high society, but the desperate, chaotic whispering of an elite crowd that had just been handed the scandal of the decade. The wealthy socialites and investors who just moments ago were eating out of Valerie's hand were now staring at her and Dominique with unhidden disgust, dissecting their total financial ruin. Valerie looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. She stumbled back a step, her hand clutching the gaudy diamond necklace at her throat, her carefully cultivated image shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Dominique was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the spilled red wine on the marble floor as the reality of her $3 million secret being exposed to her entire social circle washed over her. Before Valerie could even attempt to formulate a lie to salvage the situation, the heavy sound of frantic footsteps echoed across the floor. Connor burst through the crowd, shoving past a group of startled real estate investors. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and a thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He realized his entire operation, his grand illusion of wealth and control, was collapsing in front of the very people he needed to impress for his upcoming ventures. He lunged toward me and aggressively snatched the microphone directly from my hand. The sudden violent movement caused a sharp, piercing squeal of audio feedback to echo through the ballroom, causing several guests to wince and cover their ears. Connor ignored them, pasting on a desperate wide smile that looked more like a painful grimace. "Ladies and gentlemen," Connor boomed, his voice echoing loudly as he paced back and forth, trying to command the room and drown out the whispers. "Please forgive this little family drama. You all know how siblings can get, especially when one is feeling a little left out and emotional." He let out a forced, booming laugh that absolutely no one in the room returned. The silence from the crowd was deafening. He turned to the audience, gesturing toward Dominique and Valerie, with a sweeping, magnanimous wave of his hand. It is true that Dominique's boutique has faced some temporary cash flow challenges recently. The retail market is tough right now. But let me assure you, there is absolutely no crisis here. As the primary financial backer of this family, I have everything completely under control. In fact, the debt my sister-in-law has accrued is nothing more than a drop in the bucket compared to what Vanguard Real Estate is about to achieve. He stood taller, puffing out his chest as he prepared to deliver his ultimate saving grace. He was playing the ultimate white savior, swooping in to rescue the poor, financially illiterate women from their own mistakes. Tomorrow morning, Vanguard Real Estate is breaking ground on a brand new $100 million mega complex right in the heart of the West End. Connor announced, his voice dripping with arrogance and supreme confidence. "We are bringing luxury condominiums, high-end retail, and elite commercial spaces to a neighborhood that desperately needs modernization. This project will generate tens of millions in pure profit. It will clear any minor debts this family has and secure our legacy for generations to come." He paused, letting the massive dollar amount hang in the air, hoping it would buy back the respect of the room. A few of the investors murmured, looking mildly impressed by the sheer scale of the project. Emboldened by this slight shift in the room's energy, Connor turned his full attention back to me. His fake smile vanished entirely, replaced by a look of utter disdain. He stepped so close to me that I could see the frantic pulsing of a vein in his temple. He lowered the microphone slightly, but kept his voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear his vicious dressing down. "You think you are so clever," Maya, Connor sneered, looking me up and down with obvious disgust. "You put on a fancy dress and walk in here throwing around numbers you do not even understand. You are a receptionist. You live in a cheap apartment and you have absolutely no idea how the real world works. This is big boy real estate, Maya. This is high-level corporate development. It is not some college diversity project." He pointed a finger directly at my face, his tone dripping with condescending venom. "You can wave your little Spelman degree around all you want, but it means absolutely nothing out here in the real world. You tried to hold on to that crumbling, useless barber shop out of some pathetic sense of nostalgia. You tried to stand in the way of real progress. But you failed. Your mother signed the deed over to me yesterday. I have the final piece of the puzzle. I own the West End now. I got your grandpa's lot, and there is nothing you can do to stop the bulldozers tomorrow morning. Connor breathed heavily, staring at me with triumphant satisfaction. He fully expected me to shatter, to burst into tears, or run out of the ballroom in shame. He expected the weight of his words and the reality of his massive corporate power to finally break my spirit. Instead, I smiled warmly. It was a genuine smile of pure, absolute pity. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for my response. I did not raise my voice. I did not scramble to take the microphone back from him. I simply opened the clasp of my custom designer clutch. The soft click of the metal hardware sounded incredibly loud in the dead silent room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick piece of heavy parchment paper. It was a rolled-up city zoning map. I smoothly unrolled it, allowing Connor to see the official lines and boundaries stamped clearly across the page. I tilted my head, looking up at his sweaty, furious face. "Are you sure about that, Connor?" I asked, my voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. "Because according to city planning, your mega project is missing the central utility access lot." I did not wait for Connor to process the devastating reality of my words. I turned my back on his aggressive posturing, entirely dismissing him, and walked gracefully toward the nearest VIP table. A small group of startled local politicians and wealthy developers quickly scattered as I used one hand to sweep a massive crystal centerpiece aside. The heavy floral arrangement scraped loudly across the pristine white linen tablecloth, but I did not care. I slapped the thick parchment paper down and unrolled it flat, pinning the curling corners with two abandoned champagne flutes. Connor marched over his expensive leather shoes, echoing heavily on the hardwood floor as he rounded the table. He leaned over the map, his jaw clenched visibly tight as he tried to decipher the complex grid of architectural lines and municipal boundary markers. I tapped my manicured fingernail directly onto a small, perfectly shaded red square situated dead center in the middle of his sprawling development plan. I kept my voice loud and perfectly steady, ensuring the entire ballroom could hear the impending destruction of his corporate empire. You see, Connor building a $100 million mega complex requires a massive amount of municipal infrastructure. You need high-capacity sewage lines, industrial power grids, and commercial water mains. And according to the City of Atlanta's highly strict zoning laws for the West End Historical District, all of those primary utility lines must converge at one specific access point. I tapped the red square again, making sure his eyes followed my finger. That access point is located exactly underneath my grandfather's barber shop. Without full legal ownership of this specific patch of dirt, the City Planning Commission will never approve your permits. Your entire luxury development is completely landlocked. It is a $100 million pile of bricks with no running water and no electricity. Connor let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was loud and incredibly forced, meant to reassure the panicked investors watching our every move. He shook his head, reaching hastily into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a neatly folded document, gripping it tightly, as if it were a physical shield against the truth. It was the exact same piece of paper my mother had eagerly signed just 24 hours ago during her fake will reading. "You really are delusional," Maya Connor sneered, waving the crisp white paper right in front of my face. "Do you honestly think I did not do my due diligence before dropping $100 million into a neighborhood? My legal team drafted this contract specifically to secure the entire property. Your mother signed it completely over to Vanguard Real Estate yesterday afternoon. You watched her do it with your own two eyes. I own the shop. I own the lot. I own the utility access. You are holding a map of my property." I looked at the crinkled document in his hand and felt a deep, powerful wave of satisfaction wash over me. I had waited a decade for this exact moment. I smiled, shaking my head slowly, while looking at him with genuine, absolute pity. "I never said she did not sign the contract, Connor," I said, my voice slicing through his arrogant delusions. I am fully aware of what my mother did. She eagerly signed away the building without even reading the fine print because she was too blinded by the promise of a quick payout. She thought she had outsmarted everyone. I leaned across the table, locking eyes with him as his fake smile began to falter. But she only signed over the physical structure. She signed over the rotting wood, the caving roof, and the broken plumbing. What your highly paid corporate lawyers completely failed to realize in their rush to steal from a grieving family is that the physical building and the land underneath it are two entirely separate assets. Mother signed over the building, but she did not own the land underneath it. Valerie, who had been standing frozen near the stage, let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. She shoved her way past a wealthy socialite, her gold-sequined dress catching momentarily on a chair as she scrambled toward the table. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to frizz, and the heavy makeup on her face could no longer hide the sheer terror pulling at her features. She realized her golden goose was slipping right through her fingers. "That is a lie!" Valerie screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me, her chest heaving with panic. "I am his only child. I am Jeremiah Wilson's sole heir. There is no other family. There are no other names on any of his accounts. Probate law dictates that I inherit absolutely everything by default. The land, the building, the business, everything belongs to me." She slammed her hand down on the edge of the table, glaring at me with the same intense hatred she had harbored my entire life. She desperately turned to Connor, pleading with him to validate her claims. "She signed the papers, Connor. The lawyer said it was legally binding. Tell her it belongs to me." Connor did not look at her. He was staring intensely at the zoning map, his eyes darting frantically across the municipal seals and property lines. The horrifying realization of his own massive oversight was slowly draining the color from his face. The wealthy investors standing around the perimeter of the room began to mutter to one another, pulling out their phones to undoubtedly contact their own legal teams. I looked at my mother, watching the frantic desperation completely consume her. She had spent her entire life underestimating my grandfather, assuming he was just a simple, uneducated barber who did not understand how real generational wealth worked. She thought she could just swoop in after his funeral parade around in a cheap suit and claim the spoils of his 40 years of hard labor. She thought she had finally won. I tapped the red square on the zoning map one final time, letting the reality of their massive, catastrophic failure sink into the silent room. Not when Grandpa transferred the land deed to a corporate entity 10 years ago. The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the true gravity of my statement finally registered in Valerie's brain. The polished, elegant matriarch of Atlanta's high society vanished entirely in the blink of an eye. In her place stood a frantic, vicious woman pushed to the absolute brink of madness. Her face contorted into an ugly, furious sneer, completely devoid of the grace she had spent her entire adult life trying to mimic. She completely forgot about the hundreds of wealthy donors, local politicians, and high-powered business executives who were watching her every single move with morbid fascination. She lunged across the VIP table, her manicured hands clawing desperately at the heavy parchment paper. She knocked over the abandoned champagne flutes, sending them crashing to the marble floor in a violent spray of glass and lingering alcohol. Valerie began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice completely stripped of its usual honeyed tone. She shrieked raw, unfiltered obscenities that echoed harshly off the brilliant crystal chandeliers above us. She called me a liar, a thief, and a pathetic little snake who was trying to steal her rightful fortune and ruin her good name. The society women nearest to our table physically recoiled in horror, pulling their expensive wraps tightly around their shoulders, as Valerie's unhinged tirade grew louder and more aggressive with every passing second. Connor stood frozen beside her, completely paralyzed by the realization that his $100 million mega complex was effectively dead in the water. Valerie whirled around, her wild, frantic eyes landing on the two uniformed hotel security guards stationed near the main entrance. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. Arrest her right now! She shrieked, her chest heaving violently as she spat the words across the room. She is trespassing on private property. She is harassing my family and trying to extort my son-in-law. Get her out of my sight and throw her in a jail cell where she belongs. The two security guards, massive men with stern, intimidating expressions, immediately stepped forward. They navigated quickly through the parted sea of shocked guests, their hands resting cautiously on their dark utility belts. Dominique, who had been standing frozen in sheer terror just moments before, suddenly sprang back to life. Seeing the guards moving toward me gave her a sudden, desperate surge of false bravery. Her panic morphed instantly into a toxic, vindictive glee. "Yes, arrest her!" Dominique yelled, her voice shrill and piercing. She crashed a private, exclusive charity gala just to cause a scene. "Put her in handcuffs right now. Drag her out of here so everyone can see exactly what kind of trash she really is." Dominique crossed her arms over her chest, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across her face as the guards steadily closed the distance. She was practically vibrating with malicious excitement, fully believing she was about to watch me get humiliated and dragged out of the Four Seasons Hotel in front of Atlanta's elite. I did not step back. I did not flinch, raise my voice, or plead with the approaching men. I simply stood my ground in my heavy emerald silk gown, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable peace. The intense, dangerous confidence I radiated caused the guards to hesitate for a fraction of a second. They were clearly confused by my total lack of resistance or fear. I calmly raised my wrist and glanced down at my genuine diamond watch. The timing was absolutely flawless. I let out a soft, knowing breath and looked back up at Valerie and Dominique, my expression entirely serene. "I really would not do that if I were you, gentlemen," I said, my calm voice slicing right through Valerie's hysterical sobbing and the loud buzzing of the crowd. "Because the people you actually need to escort out of this building are about to walk through those doors." Right on cue, before the guards could even process my warning or take another step forward, the massive oak double doors of the grand ballroom did not just open, they burst apart with a resounding, booming thud. The heavy wood slammed violently against the interior walls, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the massive room. A collective sharp gasp swept through the crowd of wealthy donors. It was not the hotel manager coming to quiet the disturbance. It was the Atlanta chief of police marching into the room with absolute, undeniable authority. His uniform was crisp, his gold badge gleaming brightly under the ambient light, and his expression was dead serious. He was accompanied by 4 heavily armed officers who immediately fanned out, moving with tactical precision to secure the main entrance and block anyone from leaving. But it was the man walking confidently beside the police chief who made the remaining blood drain completely from Valerie's face. He was an older, incredibly distinguished black gentleman wearing a sharp, meticulously tailored 3-piece suit. He carried a heavy leather briefcase in one hand, his posture remarkably straight, and his gaze sweeping the room with sharp, calculating intelligence. It was Arthur Sterling, my grandfather Jeremiah's real, actual attorney. He was the brilliant, fiercely loyal lawyer my grandfather had trusted for over 30 years. He was the exact same man Valerie had explicitly bypassed and completely ignored when she hired a cheap, unethical strip mall lawyer to forge the fake will reading just 24 hours ago. Arthur's eyes scanned the chaotic ballroom before locking directly onto Valerie. His expression was cold and unyielding, signaling the absolute devastating end of her fraudulent reign. Arthur Sterling moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who held all the winning cards. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his polished dress shoes on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock for my mother. As he approached the center of the ballroom, the 2 massive security guards who had been mere seconds away from grabbing my arms suddenly froze in their tracks. Arthur did not even need to speak. He simply raised one elegantly tailored arm and gave the guards a sharp, commanding flick of his wrist. Recognizing the undeniable absolute authority radiating from both the renowned attorney and the armed police officers standing firmly behind him, the guards immediately stepped back, folding their hands and lowering their heads in total deference. Valerie was trembling so violently that the heavy gold sequins on her gaudy dress sounded like rattling chains. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow under the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. But my mother was a survivor of the most manipulative kind. Seeing the absolute destruction of her social standing staring her right in the face, she frantically tried to assemble the shattered pieces of her high society persona. She forced a bright, agonizingly tight smile onto her lips and took a hesitant, desperate step toward the older gentleman. "Arthur, darling," she cooed, her voice pitching up an octave in a pathetic attempt to sound welcoming and unbothered. "What an absolute surprise to see you here tonight. There must be some kind of terrible misunderstanding with the authorities. My youngest daughter is simply having one of her episodes, and we were just handling it quietly as a family." Arthur Sterling did not return her smile. He did not offer his hand or even acknowledge her pathetic attempt at polite conversation. He completely ignored her pleasantries, looking right through her as if she were nothing more than an unpleasant stain on the pristine floor. He walked right past her rigid, trembling form and approached the VIP table where my zoning map still lay pinned beneath the abandoned champagne flutes. With precise, deliberate movements, Arthur lifted his heavy leather briefcase and set it squarely on the center of the table. The sharp metallic snap of the latches opening echoed loudly through the dead silent room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy red folder. He turned to face my mother, his expression a mask of pure professional disgust. "Valerie, the will you gathered your family to read yesterday afternoon was a complete fabrication," Arthur stated, his voice booming with absolute clarity for the entire crowd of investors and socialites to hear. "It was a fraudulent piece of fiction drafted by a man who had absolutely no legal authority over Jeremiah Wilson's estate. Your father explicitly fired your cheap strip mall lawyer 3 years ago when he caught him trying to funnel business accounts into your personal name." A wave of loud, shocked murmurs ripped through the ballroom. Wealthy donors and local politicians began whispering fiercely to one another, realizing they had just donated thousands of dollars to a woman who was actively committing severe estate fraud. Valerie physically recoiled, clutching her chest as if she had taken a bullet. She opened her mouth to protest, to scream another lie, but her throat was completely dry. Her entire carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling into dust right in front of her most important peers. She looked wildly at Dominique, who was currently shrinking back against a massive swan ice sculpture, trying desperately to hide her face from the staring, judging crowd. But Connor was not going down without a fight. He had tens of millions of dollars on the line and an ego the size of a skyscraper. Seeing his mother-in-law completely neutralized, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He puffed out his chest, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple, and marched aggressively toward the VIP table. He towered over the older attorney, trying to use his sheer physical size and corporate arrogance to intimidate him into backing down. "Listen to me very closely, old man," Connor snarled, slamming his fist down on the table right next to Arthur's open briefcase. "I do not care what kind of petty family drama you are trying to stir up here to get a piece of the pie. I have a legally binding contract signed by the primary heir of the estate. That property is mine. My company, Vanguard Real Estate, owns the barbershop and the land underneath it. We are breaking ground tomorrow morning, and if you or this delusional receptionist try to stop my bulldozers, I will bury you both in so much litigation you will never see the inside of a courtroom again." Arthur Sterling did not flinch at the aggressive posturing. He did not step back or raise his voice. He simply looked at Connor with the calm, detached amusement of a predator watching a mouse run directly into a trap. Arthur reached into his leather briefcase one more time. He did not pull out a standard legal brief or a simple property deed. He pulled out a thick, glossy forensic report bearing the official gold seal of the State Bureau of Investigation. He slapped the heavy document down onto the table right over Connor's trembling hand. "You have a forged signature, Connor," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious timbre that completely chilled the entire room. "You and your highly paid legal team drafted a fraudulent deed and coerced a grieving woman into signing away assets she never legally owned. But that is not even the worst of it." Arthur leaned in close, his dark eyes locking onto Connor's terrified, sweating face. We ran a full comprehensive audit on the paperwork you submitted to the city planning office this morning. The notary seal on your contract is completely fraudulent. And we have the high-definition security footage from the notary's office proving exactly what time you walked in and exactly how much cash you handed him in a brown paper bag to secure that fake stamp. The heavy silence that followed Arthur Sterling's devastating revelation was immediately broken by the sharp, authoritative voice of the chief of police. He gave a swift, deliberate nod to his officers, and two heavily armed men stepped squarely up to the VIP table. Their polished black boots clicked loudly against the marble floor as they placed their hands firmly on their duty belts. They instructed Connor in no uncertain terms to step back from the briefcase and keep his hands exactly where they could see them. The sheer reality of armed police officers actively moving in on her husband finally broke through Dominique's state of absolute shock. The pristine, carefully curated image of her wealthy, powerful marriage was collapsing in real time right in front of the high society friends she had spent years trying to impress. She stumbled forward, her white silk slip dress catching on the edge of a discarded chair. Tears were streaming freely down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed Connor's tailored sleeve, her voice breaking as she asked him if it was true. She begged him to look at her and tell her that he had not actually bribed a city official or forged legal documents behind her back. Connor's reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. The suave, polished facade of the elite real estate mogul completely evaporated, revealing the volatile, arrogant bully that hid beneath the expensive suits and fancy watches. Without a single ounce of hesitation or care for his public image, he ripped his arm out of her grasp and violently shoved Dominique backward. The sheer force of his aggressive push sent her stumbling backward, her arms flailing wildly until she lost her footing entirely and crashed hard onto the cold marble floor. A collective gasp of genuine horror erupted from the crowd of wealthy onlookers. Several society women covered their mouths in shock, watching as the so-called perfect gentleman publicly assaulted his weeping wife. Even Valerie let out a startled cry, stepping away from the violent display instead of helping her favorite daughter. But Connor did not even spare a single glance down at Dominique as she sat sobbing on the floor. His eyes were wide, wild, and completely unhinged as he glared at Arthur Sterling and the police officers, treating everyone in the room as an enemy combatant. He completely ignored the officers' strict commands to remain calm and keep his hands visible. Instead, he puffed out his chest, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple, and began aggressively pointing his finger at Arthur. His face contorted into an ugly mask of pure desperation and rage. He started screaming at the top of his lungs that he was going to sue every single person in the room. He threatened to bankrupt the city planning office, the police department, and anyone else who dared to stand in the way of his grand legacy. He bragged loudly that his mega-project investors were untouchable titans of industry who would absolutely crush this pathetic attempt at a setup. "You think a single piece of camera footage is going to stop me?" Connor roared, his voice cracking under the intense strain of his own escalating panic. Vanguard Real Estate is a massive corporate entity. We have $50 million in liquid capital ready to deploy tomorrow morning. I have the best lawyers in the entire state of Georgia on retainer. We will drag this out for decades. We will bury you in so much litigation that you will be begging to hand that property over to me for free. He was practically foaming at the mouth, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He fully expected his massive wealth and his aggressive corporate intimidation tactics to force the police to back down. He thought throwing around astronomical numbers would remind everyone in the ballroom exactly who was really in charge of this city. I did not back away from his explosive tantrum. I did not call for the guards to intervene. Instead, I stepped smoothly and calmly right in front of Arthur Sterling, shielding the older gentleman from Connor's erratic movements. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my custom emerald gown sweeping across the floor as I locked eyes with the man who had just assaulted my sister and tried to steal my grandfather's legacy. I looked at him with an expression of pure icy calm. The kind of absolute, unbothered confidence that only comes from holding the final deadly piece of a very complex puzzle. I let his frantic threats hang in the dead silent air for a few seconds, letting the entire ballroom absorb his pathetic display of toxic arrogance. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead and saw the slight tremor in his hands that completely betrayed his bold words. About that $50 million, Connor, I said, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly through the massive room echoing off the high ceilings. You did not raise that money from traditional real estate investors, did you? You did not secure that capital through legitimate banks or reputable financial institutions. Because no legitimate bank would ever approve a loan of that magnitude for a project that was missing a crucial central utility access lot. Connor's frantic pacing abruptly stopped. His entire body went completely rigid, as if a sudden current of high-voltage electricity had just shot through his spine. The angry purple flush drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright ballroom lights. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as his mind desperately tried to comprehend how I could possibly know his deepest financial secrets. You knew you were missing that specific piece of land. I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, dangerous level that commanded total attention. And you knew you could not get legitimate funding without it. So you took a massive, desperate shortcut. You took a mezzanine loan from a highly aggressive private equity firm called Apex Capital, did you not? Connor froze entirely. The absolute terror in his eyes was unmistakable. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine and had already heard the final click. The heavy silence that followed my declaration hung over the ballroom like a thick, suffocating blanket. Dominique stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to comprehend that the sister she had mocked and degraded for years was not a struggling receptionist, but the brilliant head of a venture capital firm. But I was not finished. I did not give them a single second to catch their breath or process the massive reality shift. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. I calmly walked over to the digital control panel mounted on the side of the VIP table, which was connected directly to the ballroom's massive audiovisual system. With 2 quick taps on my screen, I synced my device to the main projector. The giant 100-foot display spanning the entire back wall of the ballroom flickered brightly to life. The sudden glowing image illuminated the shocked faces of the crowd, casting a sharp white light over Connor's sweating forehead. A sleek, modern logo slowly materialized, filling the massive screen with undeniable authority. It was the sharp geometric crest of Apex Capital. Connor's jaw literally dropped. The arrogant, aggressive posturing he had displayed just moments ago vanished entirely. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the carpet as he bumped heavily into the VIP table. He gripped the edge of the white linen tablecloth to keep himself from completely collapsing onto the floor. He looked up at the towering logo on the screen and then slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were completely hollowed out, devoid of all the cruel confidence he had carried his entire life. You, he stammered, his voice barely a weak, pathetic whisper. You are Apex. I nodded, my expression completely serene and utterly ruthless. I am the CEO and founder. Connor. I said, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. I am the one who personally reviewed your desperate application when every single traditional bank in the state of Georgia laughed you out of their offices. I am the one who saw how dangerously over-leveraged your company was and how sloppy your financial projections were. And I am the one who approved your $50 million mezzanine loan. I funded your entire mega project. A loud collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors. They were witnessing the absolute dismantling of a supposed real estate titan by the very woman his family had spent the entire night publicly humiliating. The sheer poetic justice of the moment kept every single person frozen in place, unwilling to miss a single second of his total destruction. The society women who had previously sneered at my entrance were now staring at me with absolute open-mouthed awe, recognizing that I was the wealthiest and most powerful person in the entire building. Dominique let out a strangled, sobbing gasp. She looked back and forth between Connor and me, her perfectly styled hair now a frizzy mess around her tear-stained face. She realized in that exact moment that the designer clothes, the luxury cars, and the lavish lifestyle she loved to rub in my face were all entirely funded by my money. I owned her husband's company. I held the financial leash to their entire existence, and I was about to pull it tight. You see, Connor? I continued pacing slowly across the front of the table, my emerald gown catching the brilliant light of the chandeliers. When Vanguard Real Estate came begging for capital, you assumed you were dealing with some faceless corporate entity in a high-rise tower. You never once bothered to look into the founding partners because your massive ego convinced you that you were the smartest man in the room. You gladly took $50 million of my money, thinking you were going to use it to bulldoze my grandfather's legacy and line your own pockets. You literally handed me the keys to your entire corporate empire, and you did not even realize it until right now. Connor was hyperventilating. His chest heaved violently under his tailored suit, and he clawed at his silk tie, trying desperately to loosen it around his thick neck, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He looked wildly at Arthur Sterling and the armed police officers, hoping for some kind of legal intervention, but they simply stood back and watched the execution unfold. But that is the true beauty of private equity, I said, tapping my phone screen one more time. The massive projector behind me transitioned to the next slide. It displayed a high-resolution scan of a highly detailed commercial lending contract. I had highlighted one specific paragraph right in the middle of the document, so the bold black text was massive and impossible to ignore. I gestured gracefully toward the screen, making sure Connor's horrified eyes followed my hand. If you recall the extensive paperwork you signed 6 months ago, you might remember this specific clause. And as per Section 4 Clause B of your Master Loan Agreement, any fraudulent activity, criminal conduct or illegal maneuvering by Vanguard Real Estate or its primary executives triggers an immediate, non-negotiable default on the entire loan balance. I stepped right into Connor's personal space, forcing him to look me directly in the eye. I kept my voice incredibly calm, but infused with a lethal cutting edge that made him physically tremble. Arthur just provided undeniable forensic proof and high-definition video evidence to the Atlanta Police Department that you bribed a city official and forged a property deed. That is a textbook definition of fraudulent activity, Connor. You violated the absolute core terms of our agreement before you even broke ground on your precious development. Valerie let out another loud, hysterical shriek, completely collapsing into a nearby chair. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as she finally understood the absolute finality of her ruin. She had traded her entire relationship with her loyal father for a single miserable dollar, and she had bet her entire future on a man who was now completely financially destroyed. Therefore, I said, my voice ringing out with total unyielding finality, your 10-year repayment term is officially revoked. The grace period is completely canceled. Your loan is due in full, tonight. The words hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before the reality of a $50 million immediate repayment completely shattered Connor's fragile sanity. The final desperate thread of his polished corporate facade snapped loudly and violently. With a primal guttural roar that sounded more animal than human, he lunged directly across the VIP table toward me. His hands curled into tight, aggressive fists, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He was fully intent on physically tearing me apart to stop the inevitable. He never even made it past the edge of the tablecloth. The Atlanta police officers who had been standing at the ready reacted with lightning speed. 2 heavily armored men intercepted Connor's reckless charge, tackling him squarely around his waist and driving him brutally into the cold marble floor. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but his fury kept him thrashing. He fought wildly against the officers, spitting and screaming obscenities as they expertly pinned his arms behind his back and pressed his cheek firmly against the polished stone. His expensive tailored jacket tore at the seam, and his perfectly styled hair fell into a sweaty, disheveled mess across his forehead. "Get off me! You rent-a-cops!" he shrieked, his voice echoing horribly through the grand ballroom. His composure was entirely gone, replaced by the feral desperation of a cornered beast. "You cannot do this to me. I am a titan in this city. You think calling this loan is going to break me, Maya. You think you have won." He strained against the heavy boots pinning him down, craning his neck to glare up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "I have a dozen secondary investors lined up from New York to Dubai." He spat a line of saliva trailing down his chin. "They will happily buy out your pathetic debt. I will secure a bridge loan by tomorrow morning, and I will use the remaining capital to bury you and this entire miserable town in legal fees for the rest of your natural life." His manic gaze darted away from me and locked onto his mother-in-law, who was still slumped weakly in her chair. "Valerie," he hollered, his voice cracking under the intense physical strain. "Valerie, I need you to co-sign the bridge loan. Call your private bankers right now. We just need to cover the margin until Monday." Valerie jolted at the sound of her name, her tear-streaked face lifting from her hands. The sheer terror of losing her elite social standing and watching her favorite daughter's luxurious lifestyle evaporate before her eyes overrode whatever shred of common sense she had left. She completely ignored the fact that her son-in-law was currently pinned to the floor by armed police officers for committing severe corporate fraud. "Yes, of course, Connor," she babbled frantically, stumbling forward in her heavy sequined dress. "I will call them right now. I will co-sign whatever you need. I will put up the Buckhead mansion as collateral. I will leverage the entire estate portfolio. We have liquid assets, we have offshore accounts, we can easily cover this minor setback." Dominique, hearing her mother validate the delusion, immediately joined in. She wiped her ruined makeup from her cheeks and glared at me with a renewed pathetic sense of superiority. "You hear that, you vindictive little receptionist?" she sneered, her voice trembling. "My husband is too big to fail. My mother has more equity in her summer homes than your little firm could ever dream of. You have not ruined us. You just made us angry." I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice or try to argue with their shared hallucination. I simply looked down at the pathetic trio with profound, unwavering pity. I slowly lifted my phone, keeping the screen perfectly visible to the entire room. My thumb hovered gently over the screen. "You really should have paid closer attention to those venture capital seminars." "Connor?" I said, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper that somehow carried to the furthest corners of the dead silent ballroom. "Because secondary investors do not bail out sinking ships when the captain is actively being indicted for a felony." With a single deliberate motion, I tapped my screen. "I just hit send on a mass email to your entire secondary investor pool," I announced cleanly. I attached the official police report Arthur so generously provided, along with the State Bureau of Investigation's unredacted findings on your bribery and forgery charges. I also included a formal notice of your default with Apex Capital. Connor's thrashing suddenly stopped. His entire body went rigidly still against the marble floor. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a sharp buzzing sound. It was coming from Connor's ripped suit pocket. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The rapid, relentless vibrations echoed loudly against the stone tiles. The notifications were coming in fast and hard. Every single buzz was a multi-million-dollar backer running for the hills. Every single vibration was another corporate sponsor pulling their funding to distance themselves from a highly radioactive criminal scandal. "Check your phone, Connor," I commanded softly, watching the last drops of color drain completely from his face. "They are pulling out live, every single one of them. Your credit is toxic, your assets are frozen, your reputation is permanently destroyed. Vanguard Real Estate is not experiencing a minor setback. You are officially, totally, and irreparably bankrupt." A low, strangled whine escaped Connor's throat. It was the sound of a man watching his entire universe collapse into a black hole of his own making. Dominique stared at her husband's vibrating pocket as if it were a ticking time bomb, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer unfiltered horror. Valerie sank slowly back into her chair, her offer to leverage the family mansion dying instantly on her lips, as she finally realized that there was absolutely no one left to save them. The relentless vibrating of the phone against the cold marble floor seemed to echo in the cavernous ballroom like a death knell. Dominique stared down at the expensive device lying just inches from her husband's pinned head. She watched the screen light up again and again as multi-million-dollar investors scrambled to sever all ties with the man writhing in the grip of the Atlanta police. The absolute reality of the situation crashed over her in a suffocating wave. The limitless credit cards, the spontaneous first-class flights to Europe, the sprawling suburban estates, and the unquestioned high society status were all evaporating into thin air right in front of her. She was legally bound to a bankrupt felon who had just been publicly humiliated by the very woman she had spent her entire life tormenting. In a display of sheer ruthless survival instinct, Dominique immediately calculated her next move. The profound loyalty and devotion she had claimed to have for her husband vanished in a fraction of a second. She did not drop to her knees to comfort him. She did not scream at the officers to let him go or try to defend his honor. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of cold calculation. She looked down at Connor as if he were nothing more than a diseased rat that had somehow crawled into her pristine life. With a sharp, aggressive thrust of her designer heel, she violently kicked his buzzing phone away. The device skittered across the polished stone floor, sliding far out of his reach and crashing into the base of a marble pillar. Connor let out a muffled, outraged gasp from the floor, his cheek still pressed hard against the tiles. He stared at his wife in sheer disbelief, watching as the woman he had committed severe corporate fraud to please completely abandoned him. But Dominique did not even spare him a second glance. She whipped her head around to face me, and her expression underwent a terrifyingly seamless transformation. The vicious, entitled sneer she had worn just moments ago melted away. Her eyes widened perfectly, and she let out a loud, theatrical sob, forcing a stream of thick crocodile tears to spill over her dark eyelashes and run down her cheeks. "Maya," she cried out, her voice trembling with a sickeningly fake vulnerability. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching out in front of her, as if she were a desperate victim seeking refuge from a monster. "Maya, please, you have to believe me." I had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind my back. The entire ballroom watched in stunned, morbid fascination as a wife publicly threw her husband to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation. Dominique closed the distance between us, her shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs. "He forced me to go along with it, Maya," she wailed dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. "He threatened me. You just saw him try to attack you like a wild animal. You know how volatile and angry he gets. I was terrified of him. I was trapped in my own home, living in constant fear of what he might do if I ever questioned his business deals." She was laying it on incredibly thick, playing the role of the abused, helpless spouse for the benefit of the police officers and the wealthy onlookers. She took another step closer, trying to grab my hands, her eyes wide and pleading. "We are sisters, Maya," she sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly. "We share the same blood. You know I loved our grandfather, and I would never, ever betray his legacy like that. Please, you have to protect me from him. You have to help me save my boutique. It is the only thing I have left now that he has completely ruined our lives." Dominique lunged forward, attempting to wrap her arms around me in a desperate theatrical embrace. I felt my stomach churn with absolute visceral revulsion. I did not break eye contact as I took a sharp, deliberate step backward, putting a solid wall of distance between us. I did not even try to hide the utter disgust written across my face. Her manicured hands grasped at empty air, and she stumbled awkwardly, her performance faltering for a fraction of a second, as she realized I was not falling for a single second of her pathetic routine. "You really missed your calling in Hollywood, Dominique," I said, my voice icy and projecting clearly through the dead, silent ballroom. "But your desperate victim routine is just as bankrupt as your husband's corporate empire." I reached back into my designer clutch, I did not pull out another financial document or a legal summons. Instead, I withdrew a small, sleek digital audio recorder. I held it up between my thumb and index finger, letting the metallic surface catch the bright light of the crystal chandeliers above us. The room was so incredibly quiet that the soft click of my thumb resting on the playback button seemed to echo off the walls. Did you honestly think I would deploy $50 million in capital to Vanguard Real Estate without conducting a massive forensic audit on your precious luxury fashion boutique? I asked, tilting my head slightly. You have been bleeding money for 3 years, Dominique. Your flagship store in Buckhead has not turned a single legitimate profit since the day you cut the ribbon. So when I hired a team of elite private investigators to look into Connor's offshore accounts, I naturally had them dig into your private business servers as well. Dominique froze completely. The fake tears instantly dried up and the trembling in her shoulders stopped. Her arms fell limply to her sides as a new, very real kind of terror seized her features. She took a slow, terrified step backward, shaking her head silently, begging me not to do whatever I was about to do. They found a lot of very interesting financial anomalies. I continued entirely unbothered by her rising panic. They found illegally commingled funds and highly questionable tax shelters. But the absolute most fascinating thing they recovered was a deleted voicemail from your private office line. A message you left for your dear husband just 3 days before our grandfather passed away. I looked down at the recorder and then back up at her pale, trembling face. Really, Dominique? I asked, my tone laced with heavy, lethal sarcasm. He forced you. He threatened you. I pressed the button. The small but incredibly powerful speaker of the digital recorder amplified the audio perfectly. Dominique's real voice, unfiltered, arrogant, and dripping with venomous greed, echoed loudly through the silent ballroom for every single socialite police officer and investor to hear. Just forge the old man's signature, babe, her recorded voice sneered, filled with cruel, impatient malice. Maya is too stupid to figure it out anyway. She is just a pathetic little receptionist who does not understand a single thing about the real world. Just get the fake notary stamp and push the paperwork through. I do not care what you have to do or how much cash it costs you. I need the liquid capital for Paris next month, and I absolutely refuse to fly commercial again. The audio clip ended with a sharp, definitive click. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and completely devastating. Dominique stood paralyzed in the center of the room, her jaw hanging slack, as her own recorded words destroyed the last shred of her dignity. Her face burned a violent, humiliated shade of crimson as the entire elite society of Atlanta stared at her in profound, absolute disgust. The final click of the digital recorder seemed to echo for an eternity. Dominique stood completely paralyzed, her manicured hands trembling violently as the undeniable reality of her own voice condemned her in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. The wealthy socialites she had spent years desperately trying to impress were now staring at her with naked revulsion. The women who had just been sipping champagne and complimenting her designer gown were actively stepping backward, pulling their husbands away as if Dominique were infected with a highly contagious disease. The sheer absolute humiliation finally broke through her arrogant facade. She let out a pathetic strangled sob and brought both hands up to cover her face, trying in vain to hide from the burning judgmental stares of her former friends. She shrank in on herself, the glamorous high society wife, instantly reduced to a terrified, exposed criminal. But the most devastating reaction did not come from the crowd or the police. It came from the woman who had taught Dominique everything she knew about manipulation and survival. Valerie had been watching the entire exchange with wide, calculating eyes. She looked at Connor pinned to the marble floor in disgrace, and then at Dominique weeping and utterly destroyed. Valerie's survival instinct, the toxic self-preservation that had defined her entire life, kicked into overdrive. She saw the ship sinking rapidly into the abyss, and she had absolutely no intention of going down with it. Without a single ounce of maternal hesitation, Valerie physically stepped away from her favorite daughter. She smoothed down the front of her sequined dress, lifted her chin, and projected her voice across the ballroom, adopting the tone of a deeply wounded, innocent victim. "I cannot believe this," Valerie announced, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured heartbreak. She looked directly at Arthur Sterling and the police chief, pressing a hand dramatically to her chest. "I had absolutely no idea. I am completely appalled by this behavior. My daughter and my son-in-law have clearly been hiding their criminal activities from me. I am just a grieving widow trying to protect my father's legacy, and they have used my trust to commit these horrible acts. I disown them both. I want nothing to do with this fraud." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the ballroom as the guests watched a mother publicly throw her own child to the wolves to save her own skin. Dominique dropped her hands from her face, staring at Valerie in absolute stunned betrayal. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg her mother for help, but no words came out. She was entirely alone, completely abandoned by the very woman who had encouraged her toxic entitlement her entire life. I stood silently, watching Valerie's desperate theatrical performance. I felt a cold, heavy knot of familiar disgust settle in my stomach. It was the exact same manipulative tactic she had used against me for years, constantly shifting the blame and rewriting history to ensure she always came out looking like the innocent party. But I was no longer the frightened teenager who shrank away from her psychological warfare. I stepped forward, my emerald silk gown gliding across the polished floor, and fixed my mother with a stare so cold and dead it made her perfectly rehearsed tears instantly dry up. "You know, Mother, I actually believe you," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "I genuinely believe you did not know about the forgery today. You are far too calculating to leave a digital trail that messy. But your hands are not clean, Valerie, not even close." Valerie stiffened her eyes, darting nervously toward the police officers and then back to me. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Maya." She deflected her voice, pitching up with defensive panic. "I am a victim of their deception just like you. Let us talk about 10 years ago," I continued, my tone dropping to a quiet, dangerous level that commanded the attention of every single person in the massive ballroom. "Let us talk about the day you stood in the kitchen and gleefully tore my full-ride academic scholarship to Spelman College into tiny little pieces. You told me I was not smart enough to go. You told me I belonged at a community college and that I was completely unworthy of attending such a prestigious institution." Valerie's face grew incredibly pale. She swallowed hard, taking a tiny step backward as the horrific ghost of her past cruelty suddenly materialized in front of her high society peers. "For 10 years I thought you tore up that scholarship purely out of spite," I said, taking another slow, deliberate step toward her. "I thought you destroyed my future simply because you hated me and could not stand the idea of me succeeding. But you did not just tear it up because you hated me, did you, Mother?" Arthur Sterling stepped smoothly up to my side. Without a single word, he reached into his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a single piece of aged yellowing paper. It was an official document sealed in a clear, protective sleeve. He handed it to me with a solemn nod. I took the document and held it up high, making sure the bright ballroom lights caught the official bank logo printed at the top. "You tore it up because Spelman required official financial verification before they could finalize my enrollment," I announced, my voice echoing with righteous, absolute clarity. "They needed a complete audit of my personal assets to clear the scholarship paperwork. And if you had submitted those documents to the university, I would have immediately found out the truth." Valerie opened her mouth to protest, but she was completely paralyzed by terror. "I would have found out that you secretly drained the $80,000 college trust fund my grandfather Jeremiah had explicitly set up in my name," I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "You stole every single penny of my education fund, and you took that $80,000 to pay for Dominique's very first disastrous fashion show because you were so desperate to buy her a place in high society. You sacrificed my entire future just to fund her pathetic vanity project." The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hung in the air, exposing Valerie not just as an enabler, but as a cold-blooded thief who had stolen from her own child. Valerie's legs finally gave out and she collapsed heavily into the chair behind her, her face buried in her hands as the crushing weight of her exposed crimes destroyed her forever. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. It was not the polite, muted murmur of high society gossip, but a raw, visceral sound of utter shock and disgust. The elite guests, the men in their tailored tuxedos and the women in their designer gowns, stared at Valerie with undisguised contempt. The final piece of her carefully constructed perfect mother facade disintegrated right before their very eyes. She was no longer the elegant grieving widow or the revered matriarch of Atlanta society. She was a petty common thief who had stolen from her own flesh and blood to fund a pathetic illusion. The silence that followed the gasp was heavier than lead. Valerie sat frozen, her face buried in her hands, her breathing shallow and ragged. She had spent decades building an empire of lies, and in a matter of minutes I had burned it completely to the ground. The wealthy socialites who had fawned over her just an hour ago were now actively stepping away, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of her exposed crimes. The police chief, who had stood silently observing the entire family implosion, finally decided that the spectacle had reached its legal conclusion. With a sharp, definitive nod, he signaled the two heavily armored officers still pinning Connor to the cold marble floor. The officers moved with practiced military efficiency. They grabbed Connor by the shoulders of his ruined tailored jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. He did not fight them this time. The fight had been completely drained out of him the moment his phone stopped buzzing with fleeing investors. He hung limply between the two officers, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the polished stone. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed loudly across the ballroom. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of a corporate titan's spectacular downfall. Connor stared blankly at the floor, a broken shell of the arrogant man who had tried to bulldoze my grandfather's legacy. Seeing her son-in-law being treated like a common street criminal somehow sparked a final desperate surge of delusion in Valerie. She dropped her hands from her ruined face and shot up from her chair, her sequined dress catching the light as she pointed a shaking manicured finger at the officers. "Unhand him right this instant," she demanded, her voice cracking with a pathetic attempt at her usual commanding authority. "Do you have any idea who we are? You cannot simply march into a private charity gala and arrest a prominent real estate developer based on the hysterical lies of a bitter, estranged daughter. I demand you release him immediately and leave this building before I have your badges." The police chief did not even blink at her frantic demands. He stepped forward, his expression carved from stone, and looked Valerie directly in the eyes. His voice carried the heavy weight of absolute, undeniable law. "Ma'am, he is under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and elder abuse," he stated cleanly, his words slicing through her hysterical protests. "We have irrefutable forensic evidence proving he forged legal property deeds belonging to a deceased man. He is going to federal prison." The chief paused, letting the severe reality of his words sink in before delivering his final blow. "And quite honestly, Mrs. Vanguard, given the financial evidence your daughter just presented regarding that stolen college trust fund, you should really be worrying about yourself." Valerie stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck, hitting the edge of her chair. She opened her mouth to argue, to spin another web of defensive lies, but she had completely run out of oxygen. I did not give her a single second to recover. I raised my hand and signaled to a man waiting patiently in the shadows at the very back of the ballroom. He was not a police officer or a socialite. He was dressed in a sharp, conservative gray suit, carrying a thick manila envelope. The crowd of wealthy guests parted silently for him, watching in morbid fascination as he walked with measured, purposeful steps directly toward our VIP table. He stopped right in front of Valerie and extended his hand, offering her the heavy envelope. She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, refusing to take it. He simply placed it on the white linen tablecloth right next to her untouched champagne glass, gave me a brief professional nod, and stepped back. Valerie's eyes darted wildly from the envelope to me. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely a dry, raspy scrape in her throat. She looked at Dominique, who was still sobbing silently nearby, but her favorite daughter offered no help. I stepped up to the table, looking down at the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. "You see, Mother," I said, my tone perfectly calm and utterly devoid of mercy, "when you are desperate to maintain an illusion of wealth, you make incredibly reckless decisions. Do you remember when Dominique wanted to open that massive flagship boutique in Buckhead? The one with the imported Italian marble floors and the crystal chandeliers. She did not have the credit history to secure those massive commercial loans on her own. So you stepped in to save the day, just like you always do for your golden child. You co-signed every single one of her aggressive business loans to guarantee she got exactly what she wanted." Valerie's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands began to shake violently as she realized exactly where this was going. She looked down at the manila envelope, her perfectly manicured nails trembling against the white linen. "And as I just demonstrated, Dominique has been bleeding money for 3 consecutive years." I continued, driving the final nail into her coffin. "She has been covering her massive losses by funneling stolen capital from Connor's offshore accounts. But Connor is going to federal prison, and his accounts have just been permanently frozen by the authorities, which means Dominique officially defaulted on every single one of those commercial loans as of this afternoon." I pointed gracefully at the thick manila envelope resting on the table. "That man is a senior representative from your private wealth bank. They do not care about your social standing or your country club memberships, Valerie. They only care about recovering their capital. And since you co-signed those defaulted loans, the bank is legally executing an immediate foreclosure on the collateral you put up to secure them." I leaned in close so she could hear every single devastating syllable. "They are foreclosing on the mansion, Valerie. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your things and vacate the property before they change the locks. You are losing everything." Valerie stared at the thick manila envelope resting beside her untouched champagne glass, as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. Her perfectly manicured hands shook so violently that she could barely grip the flap. When she finally managed to tear the heavy paper open, the thick stack of legal documents slid out onto the white linen tablecloth. The bold black letters at the very top of the page seemed to burn themselves directly into her retinas. "Notice of default, immediate foreclosure, seizure of assets." The words confirmed the absolute destruction of her entire existence. The grand Buckhead mansion, the imported luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, and the centuries of meticulously curated social standing were gone, snatched away by the exact same banking institution she had foolishly tried to outsmart. The physical toll of the realization hit her all at once. Valerie's legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed, sliding off her chair and hitting the cold marble floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Her expensive sequined gown pooled around her in a pathetic heap. She knelt right in the dead center of the grand ballroom, completely surrounded by the very people she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress. The elite society women of Atlanta, the wives of senators, CEOs, and generational billionaires, formed a tight, suffocating circle around her. They did not rush forward to help her up. They did not offer words of comfort or extend a hand of sympathy. Instead, they stared down at her with cold, unblinking eyes. The wealthy are incredibly unforgiving when it comes to the stench of poverty and the taint of a public criminal scandal. Valerie was no longer a peer. She was a cautionary tale. She was a disease they needed to immediately distance themselves from. Valerie looked wildly around the circle of perfectly lifted faces, her own makeup streaked and ruined by her earlier tears. Desperation clawed at her throat. She locked eyes with a tall, imposing woman standing near the front of the crowd. It was Martha, the reigning president of the Atlanta Heritage Club, the most exclusive and powerful social organization in the entire state. Valerie had spent 10 years aggressively campaigning and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars just to secure a seat on Martha's executive board. "Martha, please." Valerie begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She actually crawled forward a few inches on her knees, reaching a shaking hand out toward the hem of Martha's gown. Please, Martha, tell them this is a massive mistake. Tell them who I am. I am Valerie Vanguard. We host the Spring Charity Gala together every single year. You know I am good for it. You know I have the capital. Please do not let them do this to me in front of everyone. The silence in the ballroom became so intense, it was physically painful. Every single breath seemed suspended as the crowd waited for the social verdict. Martha looked down at the woman groveling at her feet. There was not a single trace of pity or friendship in her sharp gaze. There was only sheer, unfiltered disgust. She looked at Valerie the way one might look at a piece of rotting garbage that had somehow washed up onto a pristine beach. Martha did not raise her voice. She did not yell or create a scene. She simply adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, gave Valerie one final look of absolute revulsion, and completely turned her back. Without uttering a single syllable to the woman who had considered her a best friend, Martha began walking toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. It was the ultimate social execution. As if responding to a silent command, the rest of the society women immediately followed suit. The entire circle broke apart. The women turned their backs in perfect synchronized unison, acting as a single unified entity. The only sounds in the massive room were the sharp clicking of expensive designer heels against the marble floor and the soft rustling of silk gowns as the elite crowd abandoned the sinking ship. They did not look back. Not a single one of them glanced over their shoulder. They walked out of the ballroom, leaving the Vanguard family legacy to burn in the ashes of their own greed. Valerie remained frozen on her knees, her hand still reaching out into empty air. The space around her was now completely vacant. She was utterly isolated. In the background, the police officers hauled a handcuffed and defeated Connor toward the service elevators. In the corner, Dominique was sobbing hysterically over her ruined life. But Valerie was alone, trapped in the suffocating silence of her total social death. She had traded her own flesh and blood for status, and now she had absolutely nothing left. The crushing weight of her reality finally triggered a different kind of survival instinct. The begging and the pleading vanished entirely, replaced by a dark, toxic surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. Valerie slowly lowered her hand. She raised her head and locked her eyes directly onto mine. The mask of the sophisticated grieving widow was completely destroyed, revealing the bitter, vicious woman hiding underneath. She pushed herself up slightly, her chest heaving as she raised a violently shaking finger and pointed it squarely at my face. "You are a monster!" she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat, raw and jagged with fury. "You planned this! You came back here just to destroy your own family! You are exactly like your deadbeat father!" I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel. "He was a worthless street thug," she shrieked, her face contorted with pure, venomous rage. "He was a piece of trash who tried to drag me down into the gutter with him, and you are exactly the same. You are a worthless thug, and you belong in the dirt." The venom in Valerie's voice echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. I stood perfectly still, letting the toxic wave of her accusation wash over me. For my entire life, that specific lie had been her absolute favorite weapon. She had deliberately poisoned my childhood with fabricated stories of my biological father claiming he was a worthless criminal who had abandoned us in the dead of night to save his own skin. She had expertly conditioned me to believe my blood was tainted, to feel deeply ashamed of half of my own DNA. It was the ultimate psychological chain designed to keep me feeling small, inadequate, and forever dependent on her conditional approval. But right now, looking at her kneeling on the cold marble floor, in her ruined sequined gown, the grand illusion was entirely transparent. I was fully prepared to simply turn my back and walk out of that ballroom forever, leaving her to choke on the bitter ashes of her own destroyed empire. But Arthur Sterling gently touched my arm, stopping me in my tracks. The distinguished attorney had remained standing quietly by my side throughout the entire chaotic ordeal, carrying out my grandfather's final wishes with unwavering precision. He looked down at Valerie with an expression of profound professional disgust before reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He retrieved one last item. It was not a modern digital printout or a freshly drafted legal notice. It was an old, sealed, yellowing envelope, the edges worn and soft with age. He held it out to me, his expression carrying a heavy weight of sorrow and immense respect. Jeremiah gave me this envelope 5 years ago. Arthur said, his voice steady and low so only I could hear the initial words. He made me swear on my legal career that I would only hand it to you when Valerie finally showed her true colors to the world. He wanted you to know that he tried to find out the truth about your father for years, but Valerie had buried the records too deep for him to uncover until it was almost too late. I took the aged envelope from his hands, my heart suddenly pounding violently against my ribs. My fingers brushed against the brittle paper, and a strange sense of reverence washed over me. I carefully broke the thick wax seal and pulled out the contents. There were only 2 items hidden inside. The first was a photograph. It was an immaculate, brightly colored portrait of a young, handsome man. I stared at his face and felt the breath completely leave my lungs. He had my exact eyes and the very same stubborn set of my jaw. But he was not dressed like a street thug or a fleeing criminal. He was standing tall and incredibly proud, wearing a pristine United States military uniform adorned with heavy medals of honor. His smile was warm and genuine, radiating a quiet, absolute strength that completely shattered the monstrous caricature Valerie had painted in my mind for decades. I stared at the face of the man I had been taught to hate, my vision blurring with hot, sudden tears. My father was a hero. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I slid the photograph behind the second item. It was an official government document bearing the heavy embossed seal of the Department of Defense. The thick, formal text outlined a massive and highly classified financial transaction. As my eyes scanned the typed lines, the horrifying absolute truth of Valerie's ultimate deception slammed into me with the force of a freight train. The sheer magnitude of her evil was almost impossible for a normal human mind to comprehend. I looked down at the woman cowering on the floor, and I felt a cold, absolute zero calm settle deep into my bones. "You really are a masterpiece of deception, Valerie," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ruined ballroom with surgical precision. "You built your entire life, your entire high society identity, on the tragic narrative that you were a struggling single mother abandoned by a deadbeat criminal. You made me hate a man I never even had the chance to know." I held the heavy official document up high so the bright overhead chandeliers illuminated the government seal for everyone remaining in the room to see. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to look at the paper in my hands. "Let us hear what the United States government has to say about this worthless street thug," I announced, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. I read directly from the aged paper, pronouncing every single word with devastating clarity. "Official notice of casualty and life insurance disbursement. Sergeant Michael Hayes killed in active duty during a specialized overseas combat deployment. Awarded posthumous honors for exceptional bravery under heavy enemy fire." Valerie let out a horrific, strangled gasp. She scrambled backward on the polished marble, frantically shaking her head from side to side, as if she could physically outrun the terrifying truth. "No," she whimpered, her manicured hands clawing desperately at the floor. "Stop it, Maya. Shut up. Do not read that." But I did not stop. I stepped closer, towering over her shrinking, pathetic form, holding the undeniable proof of her ultimate sin. "The primary beneficiary of his military life insurance policy is listed as his legal spouse, Valerie Hayes." I continued, my voice rising in power and volume, filling the massive space. "The total payout dispersed directly into your personal bank account was exactly $500,000. I lowered the paper and stared down into her wide, terrified eyes. "He did not abandon us, Valerie. He died serving his country. He gave his life, and the military gave you $500,000 to ensure that his wife and his infant daughter would be taken care of forever. You took a dead hero's blood money," I said, the disgust in my voice thick and suffocating. "You took that $500,000 and you completely erased his existence. You used a dead soldier's money to buy your way into Atlanta high society. You bought the designer clothes, the exclusive club memberships, the heavy down payment on your very first luxury mansion. You built your entire fake glamorous empire on the grave of a brave man, and then you had the absolute pure evil audacity to look his grieving daughter in the eye and tell her he was a worthless criminal. There was nowhere left for her to run. No more lies to spin, no more wealthy socialites to manipulate, and absolutely no one left to blame. Every single layer of her perfect life had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotting hollow core underneath. The reality of what she had done, of who she truly was, crashed down on her with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. Valerie let out a sound that did not even seem human, a low, guttural wail of absolute and total defeat. She folded forward, pressing her forehead against the cold, hard marble floor, her arms wrapping tightly around her head, as if trying to shield herself from the sheer magnitude of her exposed sins. She collapsed completely and utterly destroyed. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and the police officers marched Connor Vanguard out into the corridor. The cold metallic clinking of his handcuffs faded down the hallway, signaling the absolute end of his arrogant reign. He did not look back. He did not look at his weeping wife or his destroyed mother-in-law. He simply kept his head down, letting the authorities drag him away to face the severe federal consequences of his boundless greed. Near the center of the room, Dominique remained sprawled across the polished marble. Her expensive designer gown was tangled around her legs, and her meticulously styled hair hung in ruined clumps across her tear-stained face. She was weeping loudly, a continuous pathetic wail mourning the death of her bankrupt, luxurious life. She reached a shaking hand toward her mother, hoping for one last shred of comfort or a magical solution that would make the nightmare disappear. But Valerie had absolutely nothing left to give. Valerie was curled into a tight, miserable ball on the floor, clutching the bank foreclosure notice against her chest as if it were a physical shield. The elite society she had worshipped her entire life had completely abandoned her, leaving her stranded in the wreckage of her own horrific lies. I stood over them, taking in the absolute destruction of the people who had made my life a living hell. I did not offer a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for 32 years was completely gone, replaced by a profound and steady calm. I turned to the stunned hotel manager standing frozen near the podium. I handed him the microphone, giving him a polite, professional smile. "Put the champagne on my tab," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I think we are done here." Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on Valerie and Dominique and walked away. Arthur Sterling fell into step beside me, his briefcase secured tightly in his grip. We did not speak as we navigated the long, opulent corridors of the hotel, leaving the shattered remains of the Vanguard family far behind us. Every step I took felt lighter than the last, as if gravity itself had suddenly lost its hold on me. The heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby slid open and I stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the crisp wind fill my lungs. The suffocating weight of my past was finally lifted. There would be no more toxic family dinners, masking deep-seated hatred. There would be no more desperate attempts to earn the approval of a woman who was entirely incapable of love. There would be no more hiding my immense success or downplaying my brilliant achievements just to protect the fragile egos of people who wanted to see me fail. I looked out at the glittering city skyline and realized that the frightened, desperate girl who had constantly sought validation was dead. In her place stood a woman who owned her power, her wealth, and her truth. I thanked Arthur for his unwavering loyalty and stepped into the back of my waiting town car. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I watched the hotel shrink in the rearview mirror, feeling nothing but absolute glorious freedom. The toxic chains of familial obligation were permanently severed, and the future was entirely mine to command. 3 months later, the brilliant Georgia sun was shining brightly over the historic West End of Atlanta, casting a warm golden glow over a massive crowd that had gathered on the corner. The neighborhood that had once been dismissed by developers like Connor Vanguard as a worthless casualty of gentrification was now the vibrant beating heart of the city's technological renaissance. Standing at the center of the block was a breathtaking architectural masterpiece. The old brick barbershop that had belonged to my grandfather Jeremiah had not been demolished or paved over. Instead, it had been completely restored to its original historic glory, serving as the proud anchor point of the property. Surrounding and protecting the vintage brick structure was a stunning modern complex made of sleek steel and towering panes of tinted glass. It was a perfect seamless marriage of honoring the past and building the future. High above the grand entrance, a massive brushed metal sign caught the sunlight. The bold, imposing letters read, "The Jeremiah Innovation Hub, powered by Apex Capital." The street was packed with local business owners, city council members, excited college students, and national media outlets, all eager to witness the grand opening of the most anticipated commercial development in the state. The energy in the air was electric, humming with pure potential and community pride. I stood confidently at the polished wooden podium, set up on the front steps, looking out over the massive crowd. I wore a sharp, tailored crimson suit that projected absolute authority and grace. The heavy, oversized ceremonial scissors rested in my hands directly above the wide red ribbon blocking the entrance. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing clearly across the historic street. For decades, this specific corner represented hard work, community, and the unbreakable spirit of a man who believed in lifting up those around him. I announced, my words ringing with deep conviction. My grandfather Jeremiah built a legacy here that no amount of corporate greed could ever erase. Today, we are not just opening a building. We are opening doors that have been closed to our community for far too long. I looked at the brilliant, eager faces of the young men and women standing in the front row. I am incredibly proud to announce that the Jeremiah Innovation Hub will serve exclusively as a premier tech incubator for graduates of historically Black colleges and universities. I continued, my voice rising with passionate energy. This massive complex will provide state-of-the-art resources, millions in venture capital funding, and world-class mentorship to the brightest minds in our city. And I am thrilled to confirm that this entire initiative is fully funded and permanently endowed by my firm Apex Capital. A deafening roar of applause and joyous cheering erupted from the crowd. The sound rolled through the streets, a powerful wave of triumph and hope. I smiled brightly and brought the heavy scissors together, slicing cleanly through the thick red ribbon. The crowd cheered even louder as the ribbon fell away, officially opening the doors to a brand new era. I stepped back from the podium as the attendees began flooding into the beautiful glass complex, eager to see the future taking shape. I took a quiet, solitary moment for myself. I looked up at the bright, endless blue sky above Atlanta. I thought about the brave soldier who had given his life so his daughter could thrive. I thought about the wise, gentle grandfather who had left me the ultimate key to my empire. I had exposed the villains, I had avenged my father's stolen honor, and I had permanently cemented my grandfather's legacy. I closed my eyes, a genuine, peaceful smile spreading across my face. I had finally set myself completely and eternally free. My journey taught me that no amount of stolen wealth can permanently bury the truth. You cannot build a lasting empire on a foundation of lies. For decades, I allowed my mother's toxic narrative to dictate my identity and destroy my self-worth. But I finally learned that true power comes from stepping out of the shadows of manipulation and bravely claiming your own story. Tell us in the comments if you have ever had to break free from a toxic family member to find your peace. If my journey gave you courage, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your life.